will go on to Professor Bishnupriya Dutt, Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, and her area of research includes politics and theatre, feminist readings of Indian theatre and contemporary performance practices and popular culture. Many publications. I'm not going to spend time listing all of them, but her recent publications include Maya Rao and the Indian Feminist Theatre, published from Cambridge in 2022. Theatre, Activism and Subjectivity, Searching for the Left in a Fragmented World, co-edited 2024. So, and then her recent essays include showcasing anti-colonial nationalist struggles, museums and theatre in contestation, and many others. But of course we know, just moving over the publications, Bishnupriya has also led a number of international project collaborations with various universities all over the world, including Warwick, Frey, in Berlin, and the University of Cologne. She was a distinguished fellow at the Cluster of Excellence 2020, and currently the Leverhulme Professor at the Royal Central, well, I think just completed that stage, right, at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. And she's president of the International Federation for Theatre Research. Shall I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Brinda, and thank you very much to Beyond Binaries, to Abhik and Mohammed for organizing and inviting me. And most of all, of course, thank you, Rosinka, for bringing the young Bengal back into our lives, my life. Retrieval and reinstating a history that has fallen into oblivion and ignominy takes enormous courage. As we can see, years of rigorous work, digging out archival materials and creating this very comprehensive authoritative volume. We grew up in the 60s, 70s and 80s Calcutta. Young Bengals featured in our textbooks, in our school, college and university curriculum. It was one chapter in history we all looked forward to studying. The visions of a dynamic group of young men dressed, as you mentioned, Rosinka, in those English tailored costumes, long hairstyles, sideburns, walking around the streets of Calcutta, searching for books in College Street, creating riots over the purchase of Tom Paine's Age of Reason when it first came to Calcutta Bookshop, giving arousing speeches in academic the Society for Acquisition of General Knowledge, making open gestures of defiance in front of religious institutions, openly flouting intercaste marriages, rescuing the woman from sati pyres amidst outrage, scandals and abuses. They were not only characters in history books, but also extensively reproduced, and that's actually my area of study in theatre and films. The genre of biopics, very popular in Bengal, had a cult film on Michael Dutt, directed by the veteran director Bush. And I think, what Rosinka claims, that Michael was part of the second generation of the young Bengal. And of course, my father, Dutt's first debut film. Henceforth, Michael overshadowed my family lineage even before I was born. Many people associated Dutt with Michael Dutt, a flat character sprouting Shakespeare and Milton, and it was a persona which my father adopted in his public and stage life. In 1980, he makes a play called Potipor on Michael's life and the growing politicization, which is actually, the trajectory which Rosinka tries to capture. Dutt interprets Michael's response to revolt of 1857, which, you say, and that's also true, that the Bengali intelligentsia stood in the wrong side of history with his Meghnad Bodh Kapo. In the play, he shows it in an allegory where battles for independence and freedom are lost due to betrayals and compromises by the Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar's brother and the ruling elites as the common people gear up to overthrow colonialism and Rama and his monkey in this case. And with the death of Meghnad, the sons of the emperor brutally killed, we hear, that lamenting, very famous lines, Lankar Pankoj Rabi Galausta Chale. It could have various meanings to the Bengali intellectual circles, and later we know Girish Chandra Ghosh dramatized Meghnad Wad Kapo for an audience. It was, as Rosinka tells us, an antithesis, an anti-epic, and to the mythological genre which we really attribute to Girish and his repertoire. The play depicted their growing engagement with the Indigo Revolt, Michael's overnight translation of Neil Darpon into English, and then his subsequent arrest in Paris, mistaken as Nana Sahib, the Indian revolutionary. Closer to the original narrative which follows Rosinka's trajectory is a play, really a jatra, on Derozio and his group of students, titled Chor, which was produced in 1973. This was really the first deviation of Utpal Dutt from depicting anti-colonial resistances, which were replete with patriotic passion around the militant nationalist movement. But this was a departure of writing what was a tragic view of the Bengali intelligentsia. After the first phase of radicalism and charging of society, Derozio is persecuted, harassed, and as the jatra shows, subsequently thrown out of the Hindu college and its social and public life in the melodrama style, with him being the hero and the villain Radhakanta Dev. The impoverished Derozio dies, and the narrative follows the historical narrative, but dramatized as the jatra expects into the melodramatic style. The play actually appealed to a large audiences, which is part of the jatra circuit. There's no reason why an Anglo-Indian teacher, and in the theatrical mode, dressed as an Englishman, and his students, who are heavily anglicized, could become heroes of a popular form like a jatra. Jor did 243 performances in the year, and one of the senior actors during my research told me that to the audiences in 1973, there was a resonance of young Nakshad students and their iconoclastic and courageous engagement with the political movement, and the people identified and sympathized with the young Bengal radicals in the jatra. Let us also not forget Shapun Kumar, the very legendary jatra actor's version of Michael, and before that in the Bengali theatre, Shishir Kumar Bhaduri. But I'm also thinking, Rosinka, that in the due course, in the 80s and 90s, when the theme of the Renaissance comes back into the theatre, particularly with a play on Raja Ram Mohan Roy, where Dakkinaranjan Mukherjee is an important character, we can almost see a disillusionment, a self-criticality, and the woman around which Ram Mohan and Dakkinaranjan Mukherjee are trying to organize this sort of mobilization for the abolition of sati. She ultimately chooses to go, and sort of die in the funeral pyre. And she almost, accuses the Raja that, you empathize with the woman in society, which very few people do. But do you realize that, if I will live a life of widowhood in the same family which tried to kill me in the first place? So it's not enough to save me or one woman or somebody from sati, but what about the social milieu? This was history in the popular domain, which Partho Chatterjee tells us in his introduction to the smaller voices of history, is supplemental to the inadequacies of historical research. You need the novel, he tells us, the storyteller, and to which I add theatre, to permeate what supposedly Ranojit Guha, who was an ardent theatre goer and wrote in theatre journals, sort of believed in. So when did this change? Rosinka, you mentioned Sumit Sarkar's famous essay, Complexities of the Young Bengal, and taught to us in Presidency College in 1953. by your colleague Taputiko Takuta, sort of introducing a new reading while the curriculum still had Shishubun Sarkar's notes on the Bengal Renaissance. And you know, Sumit Sarkar's critique that the young Bengals exist for a very limited period of activity. They fell hook, line, and sinker to the big logic, which gives it the economic interpretation, and finally calling the retreat a rout. But what fascinated me, and I see Rosinka using the same trajectory, when you come to the epilogue and you sort of, you know, map this trajectory of decline through Krishna Mohan Banerjee's Banyalal, who still revels in his sort of old heroism, to, as Saugata mentioned, Nabu Kumar and Ekiki Bale Saugata, a play in the repertoire in which I perform the joyous depiction of Calcutta street life of prostitutes, courtesans, the Babaji, vendors and shopkeepers, and finally, Shadabara Kadashi. So, you know, I just found those references to the theatre very, very important and appealing. So my question to Rosinka, from this personal experience with the figures and lives of the young Bengal, that is there a middle path to this binary between eulogization and iconicization of these men, these historical characters, and the sort of subsequent iconoclastic denigration? Can popular culture, and also historical scholarship in that sense, avoid that binary and create a criticality to spread a sense of critical historiography? My second sort of question on this point is that if the historical critical research discards and even discredits this important phase, and I feel, Rosinka, you framed it in your critical historiography by critiquing the subalterns and later, of course, the post-colonial historiographical perspective, that they were largely responsible for it. But why and how did it disappear from the public domain? And you say it has folkloric qualities, the stories of the young Bengals. Could it have retained a life of its own, recirculating and reconnecting to work like yours? And my third point is that you've inherently shown its significance in contemporary India as progressive liberal ideas and how they are sort of being denigrated from our civil society, and how this stands against religion is a political doctrine. And since you draw a trajectory with left politics, particularly rhetoric, does popular culture weaken as sites of right-wing mobilization and populism based on hegemonic consensus takes over? My final sort of point is, of course, you know, what fascinated me is the sort of your research and the extensive examples from theatre and cultural practices. You mentioned Titumir, which the young Bengals were attracted to, and you mentioned the plays of Utpal Dutt and Mahashweta Devi's writing. You mentioned how Radhanath Shikdar, as still a student of the Hindu College, recited Jaffa's speech from Thomas Ottaway's Venice Preserved in 1828 and Orlando from As You Like It in 1830 at the annual examination function at the Drum Hall. You mentioned Anthony Cobial, you mentioned Shakespeare, it's all true with it. So, you know, I was sort of wondering, as a historian, you go to sources, the literary text is your source, these newspaper reviews is your source. And for us who do theatre histories, there's always that problem of the ephemeral, you know, performance and the problem of the sources. So, and the final point which, you know, sort of I wanted to connect with, and that's a very influential book in our discipline, which is by a theatre historian called Tracy Davis, titled Liberal Lives and Activist Repertoire, where she follows the life of your protagonist, George Thompson, and the Chesson family. And both of you share the main protagonist, George Thompson. So what Davis is writing about the larger historical context, their personal lives and activist engagements against corn laws, anti-slavery campaigns, East India Company, and she sort of looks at this notion of dramaturgy. Not only theatre, but how, you know, these sort of actions and activism played out in the public domain, that tactics and strategies for communication and community are very central to, both our disciplines. And finally, she looks at George Thompson's daughter, Amelia, who marries Frederick Chesson, and she is also one of the first generation of music and theatre critique writing about these practices. And so what Davis does is, when George Thompson is sort of strategizing and doing these public campaigns, what were the plays he was seeing? It was Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was repertoire about, the Black Lives and a lot of these days. So these were some of my questions, and what is the dialogue between theatre and historical studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Partho, bring it here. Thank you, Bishnupriya, for bringing theatre into the loop of the discussion. Partho, Datta, I think